Stop scrolling and listen very carefully, because what just happened is not just another sanctions story, and it is not just about Venezuela. And it is not even really about gold anymore, because what we are witnessing right now is the activation of a financial weapon that was built quietly over decades and is now being used in the open for the first time at full scale. And once you understand how it works, you will realize that no country holding assets abroad is truly safe anymore. Not oil exporters, not emerging markets, not even US allies if they ever fall out of line. And that is why the seizure of Venezuela AES gold is not the end of a dispute, but the beginning of a new phase of global financial warfare where courts replace armies and balance sheets replace battlefields. And the consequences will reshape how the world stores wealth, trades, energy, and defines sovereignty itself. The United States Treasury, working in tandem with federal courts, has effectively authorized the confiscation of Venezuela's sovereign gold reserves held abroad specifically in financial centers like New York and London under the justification of enforcing judgment debts owed to corporations and hedge funds. And this single move shatters one of the most sacred assumptions of international finance, which is that sovereign reserves are untouchable and immune from seizure regardless of political disputes. Because once that assumption collapses, the entire architecture of global trust begins to crack. And Venezuela is not the real target here. It is the test case. For decades, countries have parked their gold and foreign exchange reserves in Western vaults and banks because they believed those jurisdictions were neutral, predictable, and governed by law rather than politics. And that belief allowed the dollar-based system to function smoothly because trust did the heavy lifting and enforcement was rarely needed. But today, that trust is being replaced by conditionality, where access and protection depend not on legal principle, but on political alignment and compliance with U.S. foreign policy. To understand how radical this shift is, you have to understand what sovereign gold represents. It is not just metal sitting in a vault. It is a nation, its last line of defense during crises. It is what stabilizes currencies, backstops trade, and provides emergency liquidity when markets close and credit disappears. And historically, even during wars and revolutions, sovereign gold held abroad was largely respected because violating that norm risked collapsing the system for everyone. But now that norm is being deliberately hollowed out. The justification being used is deceptively technical. Venezuela lost arbitration cases and defaulted on debts. Therefore, creditors deserve compensation, and courts are simply enforcing rulings. But that framing hides the deeper reality, which is that these seizures are only possible because sanctions have frozen Venezuela's ability to negotiate, restructure, or defend itself, creating a legal paralysis that benefits one side exclusively and turns enforcement into extraction. In normal sovereign debt, crises, negotiations come first, restructurings follow, and haircuts are shared among creditors, but sanctions short-circuit that process because they make it illegal for the sanctioned country to even talk to many of its creditors without special permission. And that permission is rarely granted, leaving courts as the only active arena. And courts are not designed to balance national survival. They are designed to enforce claims. This is where the US Treasury plays a decisive role because sanctions normally freeze assets across the board. But special licenses are now being issued that allow select creditors to bypass those sanctions and seize assets directly, which means Washington is effectively choosing winners, deciding who gets paid and who remains frozen, and that transforms sanctions from a political tool into a financial sorting mechanism where compliance and alignment determine access to wealth. Gold is the perfect first target because it is visible finite and universally liquid. Once a court authorizes its seizure, it can be sold easily and proceeds distributed quietly without disrupting markets too much. But gold is also symbolic because it sends a message that even the most sacred reserve asset is no longer protected. And once that message is sent, the next step becomes obvious. Venezuela holds the largest proven oil reserves on Earth. And oil, unlike gold, is not static. It moves constantly through ships, ports, insurers, banks, refiners, and clearing systems. And every one of those nodes represents a potential legal choke point. And once courts accept that sovereign immunity does not shield assets tied to commercial activity, every barrel becomes attachable, every payment interceptable, and every shipment vulnerable. This is not speculation, because the legal groundwork already exists under doctrines that distinguish between sovereign acts and commercial acts, and oil sales fall squarely into the commercial category, which means courts can argue they are fair game. And once that argument is accepted, the rest becomes procedural, not political. And that is the most dangerous part, because it normalizes confiscation as routine enforcement. The likely path does not begin with tankers being seized at sea. It begins with money payments for oil must clear through correspondent banks. Insurance must be provided by firms. subject to Western law, and contracts must be honored in jurisdictions that respect it. U.S. court rulings and a single judgment combined with a Treasury license can instruct a bank to divert funds owed to Venezuela into escrow for creditors. And once buyers realize payment will never reach the seller, they will walk away and trade stops without a single shot fired. Insurance is the second lever because uninsured tankers are effectively pariahs, ports will deny entry, and shippers will refuse service, and insurers do not need to be ordered to comply. They will withdraw coverage preemptively to avoid legal exposure. And this creates a cascading shutdown that looks like market behavior, but is in reality legal coercion. We have seen early versions of this strategy before with Iran, where oil exports were strangled not by blockades, but by paperwork. Insurers, banks, and compliance departments did the work. And Venezuela is now facing a more advanced version, where revenues are not just blocked, but redirected to private claimants under court supervision. And that is a qualitative escalation. The broader implications are enormous because once sovereign reserves and revenue streams can be seized through foreign courts, the concept of financial neutrality collapses. Central banks are no longer just custodians of wealth. They become political actors whose assets are contingent on alignment, and that forces a strategic rethink everywhere. This is why countries like China and Russia have spent years repatriating gold, reducing dollar exposure, and building alternative payment systems, and why many others are now accelerating similar moves, not out of ideology, but out of necessity. Because Venezuela has demonstrated the risk in real time, and no finance minister can ignore it. What makes this especially destabilizing is the selectivity allies. With debt problems are offered restructuring, and patience adversaries face seizures and enforcement, and that inconsistency exposes the system as discretionary rather than principled, which erodes confidence faster than any single sanction ever could. For Venezuela, the consequences are devastating because gold and oil are not abstract assets. They underpin the entire economy. Removing them locks the country into prolonged crisis, even if political conditions change, because recovery requires capital trust and access. And those are precisely what seizures destroy. There's also a moral dimension that is rarely acknowledged. These assets are being taken not to rebuild Venezuela or compensate its people, but to satisfy corporate claims, many held by hedge funds that bought distressed debt at deep discounts and are now being paid in full through asset liquidation. And that represents a transfer of national wealth to private entities under the banner of law from Caracas. This feels like legalized expropriation from Washington. It is rule of law without neutrality, power wearing legal clothing. And the danger is that once this approach proves effective, it will be replicated elsewhere because success breeds imitation. The strategic irony is that by pushing this weapon too far, the system may undermine itself because global finance depends on voluntary participation. And once states believe their assets are hostage to politics, they will quietly exit, diversify, and build alternatives. And while those alternatives may be clumsy, at first they will improve over time, reducing the leverage of the system that drove them away. Oil markets are particularly sensitive because energy trade has long been a pillar of dollar dominance, and if major producers and consumers begin settling outside traditional channels to avoid seizure risk, the structure of global energy finance will slowly shift, and Venezuela AS case becomes another catalyst in that long-term transformation. At the human level, the cost is immediate. Less revenue means fewer imports, less medicine, less infrastructure, and more suffering. And this reality is often buried under legal language about enforcement and accountability, but the outcome is collective punishment delivered through spreadsheets and court orders. Ultimately, the seizure of Venezuela AS gold marks a turning point because it moves from freezing assets to liquidating them from pressure to extraction. And once that line is crossed, there is no easy return because precedent once set becomes a tool waiting to be used again. Oil is next, not because of conspiracy, but because logic demands it. Gold seizures normalize confiscation. Oil seizures monetize it. And once courts and treasuries establish that sanctions and judgments override sovereignty, the global financial map changes permanently. What we are watching is not the collapse of a single country, but the mutation of the system itself, from one based on trust to one based on conditional control. And every nation connected to it must now decide whether the convenience of participation is worth the risk of exposure, because in a world where assets can be seized through licenses and rulings, sovereignty is no longer just about territory. It is about jurisdiction, clearing systems, and control over the invisible plumbing of global finance, and Venezuela is simply the first country to learn that lesson the hard way.